21 days. That was the number the steward wrote on the slip of paper he handed her at the door, before he had even taken her wet cloak, before he had offered her so much as a chair by the hall fire. 21 days, in a hand as clipped as a debt collector's, and beneath it, in smaller script, as though an afterthought. His Grace requires the library catalogued and settled by the last day of the month. No extension will be granted. She stood in the entrance hall of Ashcombe Park, with rain still running from the hem of her one good gray dress, pooling faintly on stone that had not been swept in what looked like a season, and did the arithmetic without meaning to. 21 days. Some 4,000 volumes by the look of the shelves glimpsed through the library's half-open door, leather spines stacked 3 deep in places, ledgers wedged sideways into gaps too narrow for them, a whole civilization of paper gone unattended. "You will forgive me if I do not rise," said the voice from the wing chair nearest the dying fire, though he had not risen, and did not appear to have considered it. The Duke of Ashcombe was a long shape wrapped in a blanket the color of ash, his face turned toward her with the particular weariness of a man who had run out of patience for strangers, some years before she was born. "You are the one Mrs. Levitt sent, the bookish one. I am a cataloguer, Your Grace, by training and by trade. You are 26 years old, unmarried, and the daughter of a schoolmaster who left you nothing but his debts and his Latin," he said, as though reading from a ledger of his own. "I know precisely what you are. What I do not know is whether you can finish in 3 weeks what my last 3 men could not finish in 3 years. The cruelty of it was not in the volume of his voice. He never raised it, not once, not in 21 days, but in the flatness, the way he delivered each fact like a man closing accounts. She felt the heat come up her throat and pressed it down, the way her father had taught her to press down every feeling that would not serve her. "Then I had better begin today, Your Grace, and not stand here explaining myself." Something crossed his face then, not warmth, nothing so generous as warmth, but a flicker of surprise, quickly smoothed away, the way a man smooths a coverlet over something he does not wish examined. 3 weeks, he said again, softer now, almost to himself, as though the number carried a meaning she was not yet permitted to know. "You may find the library colder than you expect. No one has properly opened it since my wife died." He did not say when that had been. The butler, standing silent by the door with his eyes fixed carefully on nothing, did not say it either, but she would learn, before the 21 days were through, that it had been a very long time indeed, and that the library had been waiting for her arrival far longer than the letter on the steward's slip suggested. The corridor to the library ran the length of the east wing, and she counted her steps along it without meaning to, a habit from years of tallying other people's ledgers, other people's rooms, other people's silences. 21 days, the steward's slip had said, and beneath that, in a smaller hand she suspected was the Duke's own, a single line: "Complete inventory before quarter day, or the collection goes to auction." She had read it 3 times on the mail coach from Bath, turning the words until they lost their shape, the way a coin loses its face from too much handling. The door, when the butler opened it, released a breath of cold air that smelled of tallow smoke long extinguished, and paper gone soft with damp. Dust lay thick enough to hold the print of the last hand that had touched the nearest shelf, and she wondered, with a small, unwelcome ache, whether that hand had belonged to the wife no one spoke of. Rain had begun against the tall windows, fine and persistent, the kind that would not stop by evening. She set down her single case, mended twice at the corner, the leather gone the color of weak tea, and did not wait for permission to remove her gloves. "You will want a fire," the butler said, not quite kindly, but not unkindly either, the way a man speaks to a horse he has not yet decided he trusts. "His Grace does not often allow one lit in here. He says the smoke settles on the bindings." He paused at the door. "You will find candles in the sideboard. Mind you do not burn through them in the first week. There will be no more sent up until the quarter." She understood him. 21 days, and not so much as an extra candle to ease them. Alone, she moved along the first case of shelves with her fingers trailing the spines, reading titles half worn from their leather by handling far more frequent than the room's neglect suggested: sermons, estate surveys, a run of naturalists' journals, their pages foxed at the edges. And here and there, tucked between more serious volumes, books that did not belong to any gentleman's ordinary taste, a slim book of Scottish ballads, its spine cracked exactly at the same page each time she opened it, as though someone had returned to that one verse again and again before setting it aside for good. She noted it the way her father had taught her to note discrepancies in a column of figures, quietly, without comment, filed away for later use. Outside, the rain thickened, and somewhere below in the house, a clock struck the half-hour, indifferent to the 20 days and some odd hours now remaining. She lit her first candle, opened her ledger to a blank page, and began, in a small, steady hand, to write down everything the room did not yet know she had seen. The ledger filled slowly, line by line, and with each entry, she felt the peculiar satisfaction of order imposed upon chaos. A satisfaction her father had called the only honest pleasure available to a woman with no fortune and too much education. She catalogued the sermons by author, the surveys by county, the naturalists' journals by year, and when she came again to the ballads, she paused longer than the task required. The crack in the spine drew her eye, like a bruise draws the hand. She did not open it a second time. Instead, she wrote its title, its condition, its position on the shelf, third from the left, fourth shelf down, wedged between a treatise on drainage and a Bible so seldom touched its gilt edges had not dulled, and moved on, though something in her would not quite let the book go. By the second hour, the candle had burned down by a visible finger's width, and the cold had settled into her hands in a way that made the pen feel foreign between her fingers. She rose, walked the length of the room to restore feeling to her feet, and it was in this restless circuit that she noticed the shelving was not, as she had first assumed, a single continuous run. Near the far wall, where the light from her candle barely reached, one case stood proud of its neighbors by perhaps half an inch, not enough to trouble an idle glance, but enough to catch a hand that had spent 3 years learning to feel for the false bottoms of merchants' account books. She pressed her palm flat against the wood. It gave, almost imperceptibly, like a tooth loosened in its socket. She did not pursue it. The hour was late. The house was silent in the particular way old houses are silent when they wish to be left alone, and she had learned long before this house that a discovery made in haste is a discovery half understood. She noted only, in the margin of her ledger, in handwriting smaller than the rest, "Case not flush, worth returning to." Then she closed the book, pinched the candle, and sat a moment in the dark listening to the rain against glass that had likely gone unwashed since the old Duchess died. 20 days remained, less the hours already spent, and she understood, with the same cold clarity that had once told her a column of figures did not balance, though the clerk swore it did, that whatever waited behind that half-inch of proud wood had been waiting considerably longer than she had. She rose, gathered her things, and let herself out into the corridor, where a single lamp burned low, and where, she was almost certain, someone had been standing only a moment before. The lamp guttered, as though a door had shut somewhere beyond it, though she had heard no door. She stood a moment with her candle case cold in her palm, listening to the house breathe around her. The particular creak of a floorboard settling, the tick of a clock 2 rooms distant, the sound rain makes when it has decided to fall all night rather than pass. No figure presented itself, and yet the air held that faint, particular disturbance a person leaves behind, the way a chair still carries the shape of whoever has just risen from it. She told herself it was the butler, making his rounds, and continued toward the stairs. She was nearly at the landing when his voice found her, not raised, never raised, but pitched precisely to carry the length of a stone corridor. "You keep late hours for a woman paid to catalogue books, not to guard them." The Duke stood in the doorway of his study, dressing gown over his shoulders, like a man who had not intended to be seen, and had decided, having been seen, to make a virtue of it. His face in the lamplight looked older than it had at supper, the skin drawn thin over the bone, the eyes very bright, too bright, the way a fire burns brightest just before it wants coal. "I found the hour had gone without my noticing, Your Grace." That is what people say when they have been caught at something. He did not move from the doorway. "What were you doing in the East Gallery?" "My work." Your work concludes at the accounts of the estate room. I did not engage you to search my walls." She felt the accusation land and did not flinch from it, having learned some years before that flinching only confirmed a man in his suspicion. "I was cataloging the case beneath the window. It does not sit flush to the wall. I made a note of it, as I make note of anything irregular, so that it might be attended to properly and not by accident." Something moved behind his eyes, quick, unwelcome, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "There is nothing behind that case," he said, "but damp and dead mortar." "Then I shall find damp and dead mortar, Your Grace, and note it as such." He looked at her the length of several breaths, and in that silence she heard the rain again, and the clock, and beneath both, or so she would tell herself later, unable to be certain even then, something that might have been the sound of a man deciding, against long habit, not to forbid a thing outright. 20 days, he said at last, as though she required reminding, as though the number were a debt she owed him, rather than the reverse. "See that your notes are thorough." He withdrew into the study before she could answer, and the door closed with no more sound than a held breath finally released, leaving her alone on the landing with the lamp, the rain, and the certainty that she had just been given, in the guise of a rebuke, something very near permission. She did not go to the case that night. It was near 10. The household long since settled into its particular silence, the silence of old houses, where servants have learned to move like weather, present but unremarked, and she judged, rightly, that a woman found prying at brickwork by candlelight would confirm every suspicion the housekeeper already held of her. Instead, she went to her room, colder than the library by half, and lay listening to the rain narrow itself into a thin, persistent tapping, and counted the days aloud into the dark. 19 now, 19, and the west wall not yet begun, and somewhere behind a case of sermons and surveys, a hollow her own knuckles had found and no one, in living memory, had thought to ask about. She woke before the maid brought water, dressed by feel, and went down, while the house still held its night breath. The case gave more trouble than she had allowed herself to hope. It was oak, and heavy with age, rather than any ornament, and it had been set into the wall. She saw this now, in better light, not merely against it, but fitted, as if by a joiner who had known precisely what he meant to conceal, and had taken some care that it not appear concealed at all. She worked the lower shelf free of its books first, stacking them with the reverence habit had made automatic even now, when her hands would not keep still. Then she knelt, and pressed her palm flat to the wood, and pushed. It gave the width of 2 fingers before the hinge, for it was a hinge, disguised as a seam, caught and held. She sat back on her heels. Somewhere above her the clock she could not see struck the half-hour, faint through 2 floors and a closed door, and she thought of him saying 20 days as though it were a debt, and of the moment after, when he had not forbidden her, and she wondered, not for the first time, but for the first time with any weight to the wondering, whether the days he counted so exactly were being spent watching a wall as closely as he watched her. The maid's step sounded on the stair above. She rose at once, straightened the books, smoothed her skirt of dust with 2 brisk motions, and by the time the girl reached the gallery she was bent over her ledger as though she had never left it, pen in hand, the cold case standing innocent behind her, its 2-finger gap closed again, but not, she was certain now, by accident of settling. Something in that house had been waiting to be pushed. She meant to find out what, before the number in her head reached 0. The maid, whose name was Peg, set down a tray of tea, gone lukewarm from its climb up 2 staircases, and said nothing of the dust on the hem of the cataloger's skirt, though her eyes marked it. She had worked in that house 9 years, and had learned, as all the staff had learned, that the library was a country unto itself, governed by rules no one below stairs cared to test. She left the tray and withdrew, and the cataloger counted the door shut before she let herself breathe again. 18 days remained. She had begun, without meaning to, marking them on the flyleaf of her own notebook in small strokes, 4 and across, the way a prisoner might mark a wall, though she told herself it was only a scholar's habit, tracking a task against its allotted hours. It did not feel like tracking a task. It felt like listening for a second clock ticking beneath the first. At 4:30 the butler came, as he came each day, ostensibly to see that the fire had been laid and the candles trimmed. Though she had come to understand, this was his manner of keeping watch over her without the indignity, to either of them, of admitting it. "His Grace asks whether the west shelves are catalogued," he said. "Not yet. There is a case that wants attention first." He looked, for the barest moment, at the case in question, the one with the false bottom she had closed again, the one that had, she was almost sure, opened itself while she knelt at the hearth 2 feet away, and something crossed his face that was not quite alarm, and not quite recognition, but stood very near the border between them. "His Grace built that case himself," he said, "before my time here. I am told he would allow no carpenter to touch it." "When was that?" "Some 20 years past, I should think." Before, he stopped, the way men of his training stopped, as though a door inside him had swung to on its own hinge. Before the household was as quiet as you find it now. He said nothing further, and she did not press him, for she had learned already that pressing him only closed what patience might, in time, open on its own. But she watched him go, and she thought of 20 years laid beside 20 days, like 2 rulers of different lengths measuring the same wall, and could not make them agree. That night she did not sleep. She lay in the narrow room she had been given above the still room and listened to the house settle, its old timbers ticking as they cooled, and told herself it was only wood. But somewhere below her, she was certain, a case with no carpenter's touch upon it in 20 years was waiting, as she was waiting, for the number in both their heads to run its course. Morning came gray and mean, with rain threading the window panes in long, unbroken lines, and she counted the days again as she dressed, the way one counts coins that will not multiply no matter how often they are turned over. 14 remained. She had begun, without meaning to think of the library, not as a room to be catalogued, but as a document itself, its shelves, a kind of prose she had not yet learned to read, and the case with no carpenter's touch, was a sentence she could not parse. She went down before the house was fully awake, when the passages still held the blue light of not quite morning, and let herself into the library with the key the housekeeper had given her on the second day, reluctantly, as though lending out a piece of her own authority. The case stood where it always stood, along the north wall, glass-fronted, its frame darker than the others, oak gone nearly black with age, and the oil of hands. She had examined it twice already and found nothing, no maker's mark, no hinge out of true, no give, in the wood where give ought not to be. But she had not, until that morning, examined the wall behind it. She drew the case forward an inch, then 2, testing its weight against her shoulder, and felt something she had not expected. It moved too easily for a piece its size, as though built to be moved, not merely to be dusted around. Behind it, the plaster was a shade paler than the plaster elsewhere in the room, a rectangle of newer work set into older, the kind of patch a man makes when he wishes a wall to look undisturbed rather than whole. She stood very still. Somewhere above her a door opened and closed, and she heard the particular, unhurried tread that could belong only to him, moving toward whatever room he took his solitary breakfast in, and she understood, with a small cold clarity, that she had perhaps 20 minutes before the house properly woke around her. She did not send for the butler. She did not send for anyone. She fetched instead the thin bookbinder's blade she carried in her workbox for lifting old bindings, and knelt at the base of the patched plaster, and began, with the same patience she gave to a cracked spine or a foxed page, to work the point of it gently along the seam where new plaster met old. It gave sooner than she expected, a thin, crumbling give, dust sifting down over her wrist like the finest flour, and behind it, not brick as she had braced herself to find, but a narrow cavity, and within the cavity, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with age, something flat and rectangular that she knew, before her fingers had fully closed on it, was not a book at all. The oilcloth had been folded with a precision that surprised her more than the hiding place itself. 3 creases, each pressed flat and sharp, as though whoever wrapped it had done so slowly, with both hands, in no fear of being discovered. She unfolded it there on the floor, dust still settling in the gray morning light through the tall windows, and found beneath the cloth not a document loose and single, as she had imagined in the 2 nights she had lain awake turning the matter over, but a letter folded in thirds and sealed once, long ago, with wax now gone the color of old amber, cracked but unbroken. She did not break it. She sat back on her heels instead, the letter resting across her palms, and became aware all at once of the sounds of the house continuing without her, a door somewhere below, the clink of a chafing dish being set upon a sideboard, a maid's voice raised briefly in the passage and then hushed. 18 days remained of her 3 weeks. She had marked them that morning in the small ledger she kept for her own accounting, a private countdown she showed no one, and she thought now, absurdly, that whatever this letter held had waited 20 years for a morning exactly like this one, and had chosen, if paper and wax could be said to choose anything, not to reveal itself in a hurry. She turned it over. The direction was written across the front in a hand she now knew as well as her own. Not to my heirs. Not to be opened upon my death. But 4 words only, ink faded to the brown of dried blood. To whoever finds this. Her breath caught, briefly, audibly, in the empty room. She thought of the marginalia she had spent 11 days transcribing, the same slant to the letters, the same habit of crossing the with a stroke that curved back on itself, like a question refusing to be finished. There was no mistaking the hand. Whatever this was, he had written it himself, and hidden it himself. Behind plaster he must have mixed or watched mixed with his own eyes. In a wall no servant would have caused to touch in 100 years of ordinary dusting. The tread she had heard earlier came again, nearer now, unhurried still, but closer than before, descending, she judged, rather than moving away, and she rose quickly, wrapping the letter back into its stiffened cloth with fingers gone suddenly clumsy, and slid it beneath the loose board of her workbox where she kept nothing else of value. She swept the plaster dust into her handkerchief. She set the bookbinder's blade back among its fellows as though it had never left its place. By the time the door opened, she was seated at the long table with a folio spread before her, her pen moving in a hand she willed to be steady, and only the faint white dust caught in the seam of her sleeve remained to say that anything at all had happened that morning. The door did not simply open. It was opened by him, which she had learned in her first week to read, as a kind of weather all its own, a sign that whatever followed would require the whole of her attention. He stood a moment on the threshold, one hand resting on the frame, as though the walk down from his rooms had cost him more than he wished her to see, and his eyes went, as they always did now, first to the shelves, and only after to her. 18 days remain, he said, by my count. By mine also, your grace. She did not look up from the folio, though her pen had gone still. He crossed to the window, and the light there was unkind to him in the particular way November light is unkind to men who have stopped eating properly. It found the hollows beneath his eyes, and did not spare them. He looked out at the wet lawn a moment before he spoke again. You have been at the east wall. It was not a question, and she understood at once that some part of her morning had been observed, or guessed at, or simply known the way a man knows his own house, down to its smallest disturbed inch of dust. She set down her pen. The shelving there wants replacing, she said. The damp has got into the plaster behind it. I thought to note it in my report, so that whoever comes after me might see to it before the books themselves take the damage. It was true, every word of it, and yet she felt the lie sitting just beneath the truth, like a stone under a stream, visible, if he cared to look closely enough, through the clear water of what she had actually said. He turned from the window. Whoever comes after you, he repeated, slowly, as though tasting the phrase for something bitter in it. You speak as if the position were already vacated. 3 weeks was the term you set me, your grace. So it was. He came nearer the table, and she caught, beneath the wool and the cold outdoor air still clinging to him, the faint dry smell of old paper that seemed to live permanently in his clothes now, as though he had begun, without quite meaning to, turning into one of his own books. 18 days, he said again, more quietly, is not nothing. She did not answer that. There seemed no safe answer to give a man whose meaning she could not yet fully read, and so she bent again to the folio, and after a moment he moved away toward the far shelves, his cane finding the worn grooves in the floor that his own footsteps must have made across countless winters before this one. Neither of them spoke again for the better part of an hour, but she was aware, the whole of that hour, of the loose board beneath her workbox, and of how very carefully she had learned, in a single morning, to keep her face like the surface of still water while something moved beneath it. The hour ended when the light did, that gray Wednesday light which in this county never seemed to arrive so much as withdraw its objections, and he left the library without another word, his cane marking his progress down the corridor in a diminishing series of taps, like a clock winding down rather than up. She waited until the sound had gone entirely before she permitted herself to breathe, as though breathing were a thing one did without thinking. 18 days. She had not asked what would happen at the end of them, whether the term meant dismissal or merely the natural conclusion of a task, and she understood now that she had not asked, because she did not wish to hear either answer confirmed in his flat, unhurried voice. Better the arithmetic remained her own, hers to work at in private, the way she worked at the folios, turning each day over to see what it concealed. She lifted the loose board that evening, only after the house had gone properly quiet, after the last footman's tread had faded above, and the fire in the grate had burned down to the particular orange stillness that meant no one was coming to tend it again before morning. The letter lay where she had left it, wrapped in the oilcloth she'd found among the mending basket, and she did not read it again. She had it by now, nearly by heart, each looping descender, each place where the ink had bled faintly into the old paper like a bruise beneath skin, but only held it, weighing it, as though it might yield something further through touch alone. 20 years by her reckoning of the dates within it. 20 years the brick had kept its silence, through housemaids and gamekeepers and at least 2 duchesses of the wider family, who must have passed this very shelf 100 times without suspecting it held anything but dust. She thought of the hours he must have spent in this room across 2 decades, dusting nothing, moving nothing, waiting, though for what, precisely, she still could not say with the certainty a person wants before she acts on a thing. A board creaked above her, ordinary and unremarkable, the house settling as houses do, and still her hand closed instinctively over the oilcloth as though the sound had eyes. 18 days remained to finish the catalogue. She did not yet know how many remained to finish whatever this was, this letter, this waiting, this old man wearing his library like a second, quieter skin, and it came to her, kneeling there with the fire gone to embers, and the cold beginning to find the backs of her hands, that these were perhaps not 2 separate countings at all, but one. She replaced the board with the particular care of someone returning a held breath to stillness, and sat a moment longer in the dark, listening to the house above her go on keeping its own considerably older silence. She did not sleep so much as make an arrangement with the night, lying in the narrow servant's bed, with the letter's contents turning over in her mind, like a coin someone kept flipping in the dark. By the time the scullery maid's tread sounded on the stair below, she had already dressed, already washed her face in water gone hard with cold, already decided, though decided was too grand a word for what was really only a refusal to leave the matter alone, that she would return to the shelf by daylight, when a creaking board could be trusted to mean nothing more than wood contracting in the cold. The library at 7 in the morning wore a different face than it had at midnight, gray light through tall windows, dust motes suspended and unhurried, the fire not yet laid. She went first to the ledger, as she always did, because the 18 days would not extend themselves for her private curiosities, and she had learned in 3 weeks of his employ that competence was the only currency he seemed to recognize. He found her there at 9:30, standing on the small step-ladder with a folio of sermons in her arms, and he said nothing about the hour or the cold or the fact that she had clearly been at work before the house itself had properly woken. He only asked, in that flat, unhurried voice of his, how far along she had come with the eastern shelves. "Further than I expected," she said, "slower than you'll like." "I have never liked anything quickly done in this room," he said, and there was something in the way he said "this room," as though the rest of the house did not merit the same care, that caught in her like a hook set gently. He did not ask about the loose board. He could not have known, she told herself this twice, walking the ladder to its next position, and yet there was a stillness in him that morning she had not seen before. Away his eyes moved once, briefly, to the third shelf from the corner, and away again. Too quick to be nothing, too slow to be accident. She said nothing. She had learned that much of him already, that the wrong question, asked a day too early, closed doors, that patience might have opened on their own. But that night, alone again with the fire banked low and the oilcloth still folded where she had left it, beneath a loose floorboard of her own making, she took a fresh sheet of paper and began, for the first time, to write down what she knew, the hand in the margins, the date on the letter, the years between them, arranging the facts, the way she arranged books, by nothing so simple as alphabet, but by whatever order might, eventually, tell her the truth. 11 days remained of the 3 weeks she had been given, and she had taken to marking them now on the inside cover of her own notebook, a small stroke each morning before she descended, as a prisoner might mark a wall, though she would not have called herself a prisoner, only a woman who had begun to feel the shape of the deadline pressing against her, like a hand at the small of her back. 11 days. The number sat oddly in her chest, neither long enough for comfort nor short enough for despair, and she found herself thinking of it at strange hours, while pouring water for tea gone cold, before she remembered to drink it, while counting the spines of a shelf she had already counted twice. The house that week had a different weather in it than the sky outside. Frost silvered the lower windows each dawn, and the corridors held a hush so complete that her own footsteps seemed an intrusion she ought to apologize for. She catalogued a run of sermons bound in cracked calf, a folio of estate maps whose ink had browned to the color of dried blood, and, on the 9th morning, though she did not yet know to call it that, a small commonplace book tucked sideways behind a set of Hume, its pages filled not with quotations but with weather, rain on such a date, frost on another, a single line in the margin of one page that read only, "She would have liked this snow," unsigned, undated, in the same hand she now knew as well as her own. She did not show it to him. She told herself this was prudence, and perhaps it was, but she suspected it was something closer to mercy, a reluctance to hand him back a grief he had gone to such trouble to bury under Latin and vellum. Instead, she added the line to her paper of facts, beneath the letter's date, beneath the margin notes, and drew a short stroke connecting them, the way she might connect two entries in an index that belonged, whether the compilers liked it or not, to the same subject. The dowager found her at this task one evening, and said nothing of it directly, only remarked, setting down a cup she had not been asked to bring, that grief in this house had always been kept the way some families kept silver, locked away and taken out, only for very particular company. She did not explain what she meant by particular company, and when the younger woman looked up to ask, the older woman had already gone, her skirts making no sound at all on the stair, leaving only the tea steaming faintly in the cold room, and the number 11, unspoken but present, hanging over the desk like a second candle burned down nearly to its dish. She let the tea go cold, as she had let so much else grow cold in that room while she worked, and turned instead to the ledger of acquisitions that the steward had left for her review, a lull after the surge of the dowager's visit, a stretch of quiet arithmetic that asked nothing of her heart. Purchases dating back to 1789, a set of Ovid bound in Morocco leather, £4 6 a globe repaired twice, the second time badly. She moved through the columns the way a woman might walk a familiar lane in fog, trusting her feet more than her eyes, and it was in this trust, this half-attention, that she found the second thing. It was not a letter, it was a name, entered in a hand she now knew as well as her own, the Duke's, younger, less certain of its own weight, beside an entry for a book she had not yet catalogued. Bound for E, that she may have something of mine when I cannot give her anything else. No date beyond the year, 1804. No further explanation, as though the writer had trusted the page to keep his meaning safe from anyone who might read it, without knowing what he meant, which was, she understood, exactly what had happened for 2 decades. She sat very still. Outside, the rain that had softened all week hardened again, striking the windows in a sudden surge, as if the weather itself understood the difference between an idle afternoon and one that mattered. She counted backward. If the wife had died in 1804, she did not yet know the precise month, only that the letter behind the brick bore a date some months later. Then this inscription had been written either just before or just after that loss, a hand steadying itself against a page the only way it knew how. She went looking for the book that evening, though 11 days remained, and the search was not, strictly, her task. She did not find it among the shelves she had already cleared. She found instead, tucked where E might have been catalogued, a gap, a space between two volumes exactly the width of a small book, dust settled thin and undisturbed around it, as though something had been removed long before her arrival and never returned. She stood before that gap for a long while, the candle guttering low, and felt the particular chill of a question she could not yet ask aloud. Not what had been hidden, but what had been taken away, and by whose hand, if not the Duke's own. 11 days. She wrote the number in the corner of her ledger that night, small and private, the way one marks a debt owed rather than a triumph achieved, and beneath it she wrote nothing else, because there was nothing yet to say. The house, in the days that followed, seemed to lean toward its own quiet. Rain came and went without conviction. The housekeeper brought tea that had gone lukewarm by the time it reached the library door, as though even the kettle understood that haste here would be unseemly. She catalogued spines, corrected old errors in the ledger left by a cataloger 3 decades dead, and did not speak of the gap on the shelf to anyone, though she thought of it as she worked. A small absence shaped exactly like a book, patient as a held breath. On the 9th day she asked the butler, carefully, whether any volumes had ever been sent out for binding or repair and not returned. "Not in my time," he said, and something in the flatness of it told her he had considered the question before she asked it, perhaps years before. "And before your time?" He did not answer at once. He set down the tray he was carrying, with more precision than the task required, aligning its edge with the table's edge, and said, "There was a maid, dismissed the winter her grace died. I could not tell you why. I was newly come to the house myself, and one did not ask the Duke such things twice. Once then, someone had asked once." She turned the sentence over as she might a coin of uncertain mint, testing its weight. That evening she found the Duke in the library before her, which had not happened before. Always she arrived to an empty room, and his presence came later, announced by the particular weight of his tread on the runner. He stood before the very shelf where the gap lived, one hand resting near it but not touching, as a man might stand near a grave he visits without kneeling. "You've noticed something is missing," he said, without turning. "I have noticed a space, Your Grace. I make no claim to know what filled it." "No," he agreed. "You wouldn't yet." He looked at her then, and there was in his face something she had not seen in 3 weeks of guarded courtesy. Not warmth exactly, but the tired attention of a man, watching to see whether a long-laid wager might, after all this time, pay out. "10 days," he said. "You keep the count better than I expected. Someone in this house ought to." He almost smiled. It cost him something to stop himself. "There are things in this library older than the shelving that holds them," he said, "and older griefs than the one you imagine. Mind the gap, miss." He paused, as though the courtesy of her name were a small extravagance he had only lately permitted himself. "But do not go digging in it yet. Some doors want opening from the inside." He left her with that riddle and the sound of his stick upon the boards, a diminishing rhythm down the corridor, and she stood a long while in the space he had vacated, turning his words over as she might turn a coin to see if it were counterfeit. Doors want opening from the inside. She had catalogued 411 volumes in 19 days. She had learned the particular ache of cold fingers on cracked leather, the smell of tallow and dust that clung to her sleeves past midnight, the precise creak of the 3rd library step that always startled the mice and never the housekeeper. She had not learned, until that moment, that the gap upon the 3rd shelf was not an absence to be catalogued at all, but a door. She did not touch it that night. She had promised, after a fashion, though he had asked nothing outright, and she had begun to understand that with him, a thing half said was a thing meant to be honored twice over. 10 days. The number sat in her chest like a stone swallowed whole. She worked instead upon the ledgers of acquisition, the Duke's own hand marching down decades of pages in a script that grew steadier as the years went backward, as though the man who had once written boldly had, somewhere in the middle years, folded in upon himself, and only in old age begun, very slightly, to unfold again. She found his marginalia in a volume of Cowper, dated the year of his marriage. She found none at all for 11 years after. The silence in the ledgers was as loud as any letter. On the 4th morning of the count, snow came early to the valley, powdering the yew hedges the color of old linen, and she watched it from the library window with a cup of tea gone cold in her hand, thinking of the housekeeper's warning on her first day. Mind what you disturb in that room, it has swallowed better women than you. And wondering whether Mrs. Pruitt had meant it as cruelty or as mercy. The butler found her there at noon, snowlight falling flat and white across the long table, and set down a tray without a word, though he lingered a moment longer than duty required. "His Grace does not often speak of gaps," he said at last, as though the sentence cost him something borrowed against his own discretion. "No," she said, "I gathered as much. He spoke of one to you." It was not a question, and she did not answer it as one. The old man studied her face, the way he might have studied a barometer before deciding whether to bring in the washing, and then he nodded once, satisfied by whatever he found there, and left her to the snow, and the silence, and the 9 days that remained. 9 days. She had begun, without quite meaning to, marking them the way the estate's old clock in the hall marked hours it no longer bothered to strike correctly, by habit, by dread, by the small violence of numbers narrowing toward a fixed point. She had written the figure on a scrap of paper and tucked it beneath the ledger, not to remember it, for she could not have forgotten it, but as though seeing it in her own hand made it a fact rather than a fear. The gap the butler would not speak of sat between 2 folios on the 4th shelf, a space no wider than a hymn book, and she had noticed it on the 2nd week and said nothing, because saying nothing had become, in that house, its own kind of fluency. She measured it now with 2 fingers, the way she might have measured a wound, to see whether it was healing or widening, and found it exactly as it had been, empty, patient, waiting for whatever the Duke had removed from it long before she arrived to notice its absence. She did not ask him about it that day. She had learned, in the manner of learning a difficult hand of handwriting, that his silences carried grammar of their own, and that to press too soon was to blot the page. Instead, she catalogued forward, through account books gone soft with damp and a bundle of sermons no one had opened since the year stamped upon their spines, and let the gap sit in her mind the way a held breath sits in the chest, not forgotten, only postponed. At 4, with the light already failing, she brought him tea in the small parlor where he had taken to sitting since the cold set into his knees, and found him with his eyes closed and his hands folded, in the attitude of a man listening to something the room was not providing. 8 days, he said, without opening his eyes, and she understood he had been keeping the same count as she, though for reasons he had not yet let her see the whole of. "Yes, Your Grace. You have found the gap on the 4th shelf." It was, again, not a question, and she gave it the same courtesy she had given the butlers. "I have." "Good," he said, and nothing more, and the fire cracked once in the grate, as though it, too, had opinions on the matter it dared not voice. She left him to his tea and his listening, and walked back through the corridor where the portraits hung in their long, patient rows, and thought, not for the first time, that the house did not keep its secrets locked away so much as it kept them waiting, the way a good tutor waits for a slow pupil to arrive, unprompted, at the sum he has known all along. 8 days. She resolved, climbing the stair to her small, cold room, that she would not be the one to arrive too late. The room, when she reached it, offered no comfort beyond its narrowness. A washstand, a candle burned to a stub, a window that let in more draught than moon, and she sat upon the bed's edge with her boots still laced, turning over the Duke's 2 words as though they were coins, whose value she had not yet learned to read. Good. Not. Well done. Not. I am pleased. A word a man might give a horse that had, at last, taken the bit without flinching. She told herself this should not matter, and found, with some irritation at herself, that it did. She did not sleep long. By 5 she was in the library with a single candle, and the ledger open across her knees, and it was there, in the gray hour before the house woke, that the wave broke over her. The 4th shelf's gap, she had assumed, wanted only a missing volume, some sermon or survey she had not yet located among the crates in the cellar. But the ledger, cross-referenced against the acquisition dates she had painstakingly restored, showed no book ever entered there at all. The gap was original. The shelf had been built with a space in it, the way a drawer is built with a false bottom, and no one, not the housekeeper, not the butler, not 30 years of dust, had thought to ask why a man who filled every other inch of his walls with paper had left one space, at eye height, precisely empty. She stood so quickly, the candle guttered. Behind the gap, when she pressed her palm flat against the paneling, the wood gave, not much, the width of a coin, and held. She did not force it. She had learned that much, at least in 8, now 7 days, that this house yielded nothing to force, only to patience, the way a stubborn latch yields to the hand that has learned its particular reluctance. She marked the place with a strip of ribbon torn from her own cuff, extinguished the candle, and went down to breakfast with her hands folded as though they had touched nothing at all. At the table, the dowager watched her over the rim of a chocolate cup with the mild, terrible attention of a woman who missed nothing and forgave less. "You have the look," she said, "of someone who has found a mouse in the wainscoting and does not wish to say so at table. I have found nothing yet, madam." "Yet," the dowager repeated, and set down her cup with a small, decisive click, as if she had settled a wager with herself. "Well, there is time." 7 days, the butler murmured, entering with the post, and did not look up as he said it, though she felt, rather than saw, the weight of his glance pass over her like a hand testing the temperature of water before deciding whether to trust it. 7 days, she thought, climbing back toward the library before the toast had gone cold, and quickened her step. The library received her the way it always did at that hour, with the particular hush of dust settling back into place after a night's disturbance, and she went straight to the shelf where the ribbon hung like a small confession. Behind it, the brick she had already tested sat a half-inch proud of its neighbors, and she pressed her palm flat against the cold face of it and felt, beneath the stone's patience, something that was not stone at all, a give, a breath, the faintest suggestion of hollow space holding its silence the way a held breath holds itself before speech. She did not pry it loose. Not yet. 7 days, the butler had said, and the number sat in her chest now like a coin swallowed too quickly, present, and unmovable, and impossible to ignore. She had catalogued 1,100 volumes in a fortnight, and had told herself, in the small hours, that the number was proof of her diligence. Now it seemed only a tally of days spent, each one drawn down from a sum that had never been generous to begin with. The Duke did not come to the library that morning, nor the next, and his absence had its own weather, a kind of low pressure that made the servants speak more softly in the corridors, and made the dowager's silences, when she passed her on the stair, longer than they had been. "He is tired," was all the housekeeper offered, in the tone of a woman handing over a coin she suspected was counterfeit, but had no better one to give. She worked through the tiredness of the house, as though industry might hold something at bay. She catalogued the estate ledgers from a decade she had not yet touched, found in them a hand that matched, unmistakably, the marginalia in the bricks near shelf, and understood, with the particular vertigo of a fact arriving before its explanation, that whatever waited behind that stone had been placed there by the same hand that now lay somewhere above her, growing quieter by the day. On the 5th evening she stood before the gap again, candle low, ribbon trembling faintly in a draught she could not account for, and found she had stopped reaching for it. Not from fear exactly, but from something nearer to reverence, the sense that some doors ought to be entered only when one is prepared to be changed by what lies past them. 2 days, she told herself, testing the number's weight the way one tests ice, before committing a foot to it. Then she reached in, and the brick came away in her hand like something that had been waiting, patiently, for 20 years, to be asked. The letter lay behind the brick, in a wrapping of oiled cloth gone brittle at its folds, and she drew it out with the care one gives to something that has outlived every person who might have expected it to be found. The seal was unbroken, wax, dark red, pressed with no crest she recognized, only a plain oval, as though the man who set it had wanted, for once in his life, to write without the weight of his name pressing down on the page. She did not break it. She held the letter in both hands the way she might hold a bird fallen from its nest, uncertain whether the kindest thing was to carry it further or to leave it exactly where it had been. 16 days remained. She had marked them that morning on the inside cover of her own notebook, a private ledger no one else would read, and the number had felt, until this moment, like the whole shape of her employment, the wall she was building toward, brick by counted brick. Now it felt it differently. 16 days was no longer a wall. It was the space left to understand what she was holding before whatever clock governed the house upstairs finished its own counting. She did not open it that night. She told herself this was prudence, that a document addressed, as the outer fold read in a hand she now knew as well as her own. To whoever finds this, deserved a witness less exhausted than she was, a mind less inclined to read meaning into every serif from want of sleep. But she suspected, turning the thing over by candlelight, that the truer reason was smaller and less noble. She was afraid of finishing something that had taken 20 years to begin. The housekeeper found her still in the gallery near midnight, coat still buttoned against a chill she had stopped noticing hours before, and said nothing about the hour, only looked at the letter in her hands, and then at her face, and seemed to arrive at some private conclusion she did not share. "He does not sleep past 4 most nights now," the housekeeper said instead, as though this were the relevant fact, and perhaps it was. "If you mean to ask him anything, you'd do well not to wait for morning to feel like the right time. It rarely does in this house." She wrapped the letter again in its cloth, though she could not have said why, some instinct toward preserving a thing not yet fully hers to unmake. 16 days. She thought of the marginalia matching hand for hand, of a young man's writing grown old above her in a room she had entered only twice, and understood, with the calm of a decision already made somewhere beneath conscious reckoning, that she would not wait for the 16th day to ask him what he had meant to say. She found him at 5:30, which surprised her less than it might have a fortnight prior, in the small breakfast room where a single lamp burned against a sky still black at the windows. He was seated before an untouched plate, his hands folded on the table's edge in the manner of a man arranging himself for an audience he had not requested. She noticed the cup of tea beside him had gone cold enough to have grown a skin, and that no one had thought, or dared, to replace it. "You have found something," he said, before she had crossed the threshold, and it was not a question. 16 days ago, she said. "I did not come sooner, because I did not know what I had found. And now you do. Now I think I do." She set the cloth-wrapped letter on the table between them, not unwrapping it, waiting to see whether he would reach for it or turn away, as she had watched him turn from smaller things, a broken hinge, a servant's grief, the whole weight of feeling itself. He did neither. He looked at the shape of it under the cloth, the way a man looks at a face he has not seen in 20 years and is uncertain he wishes to recognize. "Behind the bricks," he said, "the third bay." "You knew." "I knew there was a third bay that no one had asked me about in 19 years. His voice carried no triumph in this, only a kind of exhausted arithmetic. I had begun to think I would die before anyone did. Outside, a servant's boots crossed gravel toward the stables, the sound thin and ordinary against the size of what sat unspoken between them. She thought of the housekeeper's words. "It rarely does, in this house," and found she agreed with them entirely. "I have not read it," she said. "I could not decide if it belonged to me to read." "It does not," he said, and for a moment she thought he meant to take it from her, seal it back into its silence for however many days remained him. Instead he said, "Not yet," and something in the phrasing, the yet, small and deliberate, undid more of her composure than any cruelty he had offered her in 3 weeks of ledgers and locked doors. When, then, he looked at the window, where the black was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to soften toward gray. "When there are fewer days left to waste on deciding," he said, "then there are pages in it to read." She did not ask how many that was. She suspected, from the weight of the cloth alone, that he already knew, and had known the answer to that arithmetic for longer than she had been alive. She did not press him further. There are questions that answer themselves given enough silence, and she had learned, in 3 weeks under his roof, that silence was the currency he traded in most fluently. She returned to her room with the letter still wrapped in its brittle cloth, and she did not open it. She set it on the writing desk beside the inventory ledger, and for a long while she only looked at the two objects side by side, one recording the disposition of chairs and clocks and portraits, the other recording something she suspected no ledger had ever been built to hold. 4 days remained of the 3 weeks she had been given. She counted them now the way a woman counts coins she does not expect to keep, carefully, and with a kind of grief already folded into the arithmetic. On the 15th day she catalogued the estate maps, dry work that asked nothing of her attention, and found her mind returning again and again to the shape of his handwriting on the letter's seal, the same slant she had traced through 100 marginal notes, without once thinking to ask what hand had made them, or what year, or what grief. On the 16th day the weather turned, rain coming in off the moor in long gray sheets that darkened the library windows by noon, and the housekeeper brought up tea that went cold twice before either of them thought to drink it. He did not mention the letter. She did not ask again when. There was a kind of mercy in the waiting, she found, a stretch of ordinary hours in which nothing was required of her but the counting of books, and she let herself rest in it the way a traveler rests before the last, steep part of a climb. But the rest did not last, as rests in that house never seemed to. On the 17th evening he sent for her earlier than usual, before the candles were properly lit, and when she came into the library she found him already seated, the letter no longer on her desk but on his knee, his hand resting flat upon it, as though to keep it from lifting on some draught only he could feel. 3 days, he said, without preamble, since I told you there was an arithmetic to this. I find I have grown impatient with my own sums. She stood in the doorway with rain still cold on her shoulders and felt the whole house lean, very slightly, toward whatever he meant to say next. The shelves, the dust, the years of locked silence all gathering themselves, as if even the walls understood that the counting was nearly finished. She did not answer at once. She had learned, in 17 days, that his silences were not empty rooms but furnished ones, and that to speak too quickly into them was to trample something arranged with care. So she crossed the floor slowly, her half-boots leaving faint wet prints on the boards, and set down the ledger she carried without being asked to. "What sums," she said finally, "trouble a man who has kept the same figures for 20 years?" He looked at her then with something she had not seen in his face before, not the guardedness of the first week, nor the grudging attention of the second, but a kind of naked calculation, as though he were weighing her against a memory only he could see. "The sum of days," he said. "I had allowed myself 3 weeks to be certain. I find 3 weeks was a vanity. A man in my condition does not always get to finish his arithmetic at his leisure." The fire cracked. Outside, the rain had thinned to a fine, persistent mist that beaded on the library windows and blurred the dark garden beyond into something formless. She thought of Mrs. Pruitt's warnings, of the physician's carriage that had come twice that month and left without explanation, of the way his hand of late trembled faintly over the smallest tasks, turning a page, lifting a cup, and she understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, what kind of arithmetic he meant. "You are asking whether 4 days will be enough," she said. "I am telling you they will have to be." He said it without self-pity, the way he might have remarked on a change in the weather, and that plainness frightened her more than any grief could have. "I have spent 20 years waiting for someone to be patient enough. I find I no longer have the luxury of waiting to see whether patience was the only virtue required." She wanted to ask him what else he needed of her, what test remained, what final ledger she had not yet balanced. But something in his stillness told her the asking itself would be its own small failure, that he wanted her to arrive at it without being led. So instead she only nodded, and reached for the letter still resting under his hand. not to take it from him, but to see, once more, the shape of the hand that had written it, young, certain, unbroken by the years that had since bent the one now watching her. "Then we had better not waste the 4 days," she said. For the first time since she had come into that house, he almost smiled. The 4 days did not pass so much as accumulate, the way frost accumulates on a window pane, thin at first, then suddenly complete. On the first, he sat with her while she worked through the final uncatalogued shelf, a run of sermons no one had opened since the previous century, and he corrected her Latin twice without unkindness, the way a man corrects a habit he has grown fond of in another. On the second, he did not rise from his chair at all, and the housekeeper brought his broth to the library rather than ask him to climb the stairs, and he ate almost none of it while watching her hands sort paper, with an attention that had stopped pretending to be about the paper. On the third day it rained without pause from morning until the lamps were lit, and the sound of it against the high windows filled every silence between them so thoroughly that neither felt the need to speak for the better part of an hour. She found herself counting, without meaning to, the number of days remaining. 3, then that evening 2, the way one counts the strokes of a clock, in a room where the clock cannot be seen, but only heard, felt, in the pulse of one's own attention. She had stopped believing the deadline meant dismissal. She had not yet let herself believe what it might mean instead. The dowager came twice that week, and left both times with her mouth set in a line that was not quite disapproval, and not quite grief. And once she paused at the library door long enough to say, to no one in particular, that she had not seen him read anything aloud in 11 years, and that he had read to the girl from a shelf of poetry the previous evening for nearly 40 minutes without stopping. The butler, passing with the lamp oil, said nothing at all, but began, without being asked, to keep the fire in the library built higher than the house account strictly allowed. On the morning of the 4th day, which she understood without being told was the last true day before the 21st, he did not ask her to work. He asked her instead to sit, in the chair that had for 3 weeks belonged to no one, and he told her, in the plain, unhurried voice of a man settling an account he had carried a long time, that tomorrow she would read the letter to him aloud, not because he could not read it himself, but because he wished, once, to hear it in a voice that was not his own, and was not yet ash. On the 21st day, the rain came early, and stopped before noon, leaving the gravel dark, and the windows streaked with a light too pale to warm anything. She found him already in the library, in the chair by the cold hearth that the butler had, against all sense, not yet lit, as though the day required to be met without comfort. He gestured, without rising, to the desk drawer where the letter had been kept these 3 weeks, wrapped now in a square of clean linen instead of the brittle paper that had first held it. She read it standing, because it did not occur to her to sit, and because some part of her understood that a thing carried 20 years should not be received while seated. The hand was steadier on the page than his own had become. "To whoever finds this," it began, and she had read those words to herself 100 times without once hearing them aloud, and hearing them now, she understood for the first time that they had not been written to a stranger at all, but to a particular kind of patience, waited for the way a man waits for weather to turn. She read of a wife, 11 months married, and then not living, of a library sealed the week after her funeral because he could not bear to be read to by anyone who was not her, of a vow set down at 34 in ink that had gone the color of dried blood, that if ever a soul loved these shelves enough to find what he had hidden in them, that soul should have the library outright, free of the entail, the one possession in his life that answered to no lawyer and no cousin and no future duke. She finished. The room did not applaud itself into meaning. It only held its silence, the way it had held silence for 2 decades. "You have watched me 3 weeks," she said, not quite a question. "I have watched for 20 years, he said, for someone who would notice what the others walked past. You are the first who stayed long enough to let me finish saying it." He did not rise, but he opened his hand, and in it, small and warm from where it had rested against him all morning, lay the brass key to the library's private door, the one that opened from the garden, that no steward's ledger had ever recorded. He placed it in her palm and closed her fingers over it himself, as a man closes a book he does not intend to open again in company. Some men, The story might have said, wait 20 years to speak a single sentence, and die soon after having said it, and are not sorry. She was the first person patient enough to let him finish.